So I've recently just watched your latest film, Star One. Learned that there was a previous version of this film called Starship Rising. What was the reason to go back and re-edit the film, and what were the major changes between Star One, the 2026 film, and Starship Rising, the previous version of the film?
Originally, uh, I think I made the film in 2012 or thereabouts. And the situation was a bit odd. I had a stalker who died around that time. Prior to that, she was making severe death threats and had guns. And I wasn't directly scared by it, but it was a bit annoying. I was a bit paranoid about things. Normally, I would have gone out on location and shot in Los Angeles or out in California in the desert. But I developed this weird sense of wanting to go out in public. And it's only a very minor thing, but how it translated was I can make this movie or movies and I can do them all on green screen with a red cinema camera in 4K. Now, it'd kind of been done before by other people, but I thought, well, maybe I can, do partial sets. I could build a real spaceship, and then for the second half, I could actually use green screen. So it's just kind of this paranoia of literally fear of getting shot, because when you got a crew of 30 people, the word gets out you're doing a movie. And believe me, the word did get out. And you could figure out where the studio was. It was in Canoga Park in California. And it was a pretty good area to film in because the police were very friendly. But it was also this thing in the back of your head, this paranoia. And I was receiving death threats from this woman, Wendy Finer was her name. She's now passed away. She overdosed on drugs. Combination of some medication and a lot of vodka. That was her thing. So she OD'd, I think, when the film was just finished. I was really paranoid. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do it all green screen. I'm not going to go out in the desert and get arrested again or anything else because, those fears creep in. And I figured this would be an interesting way to try and up my game a little bit. In retrospect, maybe I should have done it differently. But it was such a big crew. We're talking 30 people, actors and crew, to get them out on location. That means many trucks, and it's just got really expensive. And I already was paying the rent on the studio. So I figured, let's just try to keep it in-house. It cost me a lot of money. The distributors came to me and said, we want a film that's like Star Trek, because Star Trek had come out. And it's like, I don't want to do a Star Trek movie. Because if you want Star Trek, you watch Star Trek. So I'm going to try and do something different. And I figured I would try and do something like a dark science fiction film along the lines of the heavy metal comics or, those sort of really dark, epic sci-fi things that nobody ever made that type of movie. And that included, a bit of physical brutality and a lot of swear words and what have you. And I know now that's been done with Rebel Moon parts 1 and 2. Well, weirdly enough, this was a part 1 and 2 as well. And it was a similar vein as Rebel Moon and born out of a similar frustration of you want some dark, epic sci-fi. And I wanted that, but I didn't want to copy off Star Trek. It would have been so easy. And I kid you not, I was offered a sequel to a Star Trek ripoff film. And I thought, well, that first Star Trek ripoff film that my distributor had done and made a lot of money on, I didn't want to go that path because it's like a sequel to a movie I don't like. It's not cool. So I just created my own universe. And that's kind of how it came about. But I think there was then a lot of pressure to get the thing done, and computers weren't where they are now. And I wanted to finish it in 4K, but then I was doing a lot of green screen and visual effects. And that's a lot of work in post-production. So the first one took over a year to finish. And then they said, well, the distributor or the sales agent said, we've already sold film 2, which we know you've shot. Please get it out in 3 months. So I had to really, 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 really rush to do film number 2.
When did it become 2 films? Was it always, and you're no stranger to a project becoming longer or bigger? Time War, for example. I've enjoyed hearing about the progress of that. So you're no stranger to expanding on your projects. But to go back to 2012, when did Starship Rising, as it was called, become more than one movie?
That's an interesting question, and it was always meant to be that way. In the writing, I thought, well, if I want to do a big epic story, I mean, everyone does trilogies. I didn't really have a lot of money. I had some money, but I looked at it, and let's just say it was to do one film would cost, I'm throwing numbers out there, say it would cost $100,000 to do one movie. The second movie would be an extra 25,000. So it was basically to do the second film would be one quarter of the budget more. And so I thought to myself, stupidly, I can I can get two movies for the price of one and a quarter. Problem is, when you got a sequel, people don't always want the sequel, and they're not going to spend the money on the sequel, even though the sequel to Starship Rising, which is Starship Apocalypse, it later now renames Star One and Star One Resurrection. I actually like the second one some ways more because it has more comedy, but the second one was really rushed. And I say that because I was given a terrible deadline, and I look at the interviews from back in that time period, and I'm like really fat. It's like I didn't move for 2 months, and you can tell this is what happens when you don't do exercise. It was always a haunting thing that I didn't really get the time to finish it the way I wanted to, either film. So then come around to 2026, I wanted to put something. We were discussing re-releasing the movie rather than, because at the time when the movies were made, there were copies of this on DVDs in Germany and UK. Like you could walk into Tesco in the UK. It was on the shelf. Both films were on the shelf, which was very exciting. But it's physical media. Now it's all streaming, and nobody had sold the streaming rights for these movies. So I thought, well, I'm going to reapproach them now. And the major changes I did were, I've got this wonderful actor called Stephen Manley, who I didn't know at the time, and he was in Star Trek movie and a whole bunch of other things. He's a very solid actor. It's one of my most beloved actor friends, and I decided I'd slot him in. The problem was I wasn't happy with a few elements, like the voice of the overseer. I guess you could say that was voiced by me. And it was voiced by me because I was in a hurry and I couldn't find the right voice acting wise. So I ended up doing it myself. And I'm not saying I'm good, but it was adequate for the character. But in retrospect, I'm not an actor and I shouldn't be. So, that was the story. So I wanted to really expand the story. And that's why there's still an hour's worth of footage, scenes that have not been seen by anybody. For Star One and Star One Resurrection, there's still 1 hour's worth of footage unseen. And they're quite special and magical. I just didn't have the time to finish them. And it really expands the universe and the mythology of the story. It's just something that I'll eventually revisit again. But right now, what I wanted to do was put Stephen Manley, the actor, as the voice of the overseer, which means you can suddenly start to understand the character a little bit more, and also a little bit of an introduction and a bit of an outro to try to explain. It does all connect because it does connect with the other scenes of the film. So.
It flows better, does Star One, because I'd seen Starship Rise. You mentioned that you could buy these things on physical media. I have them upstairs. I have Apocalypse and Rising on DVD. They still work. I've seen them maybe 2-3 times over the years, and one of the things that I find about the particular type of sci-fi that you do is and I don't know if highbrow is the correct way to do it, but it's not Star Wars, where Star Wars you go in and you go, Vader bad, Luke Skywalker good person, I know everything I need to know, right, I'm sorted, you could sit down and just watch the space battles. Yours is a bit more intellectual, and in some of your movies, I'm like, okay, so who's this character? What side are they on? And I find that applied to Rising and Apocalypse. But recently, watching Star One, I followed it fine. Some will say it's because you've seen the films 3 or 4 times. I don't think it was that. I think so. Some of the changes that you've done, I don't know what the changes are, other than the inclusion of Stephen Manley. Shout out to Star Trek 3: Search for Spock. The film flows better. It just seems to be more accessible to everyday sci-fi fans like me. Watching Star One now in 2026 compared to watching it for the first time in 2012, the film seemed to flow a lot better for me. And what was the major changes that you've done from the earlier version to this one? I do have a few small critiques of the movie. There are very, very few films that are 100% perfect, 10 out of 10 perfect. For me, there's some language in there, so some F bombs that are in there. There is an assault scene quite early on in the film. My critique of it, and it is only a tiny critique, and it isn't anything that took away any enjoyment of the film for me. I still really, really like watching Star One. But I think if it wasn't for the F bombs and that one assault scene, I think Star One would be a perfect entry point for indie sci-fi fans. So for those to watch that aren't just obsessed with Star Wars or Star Trek. So what's your thoughts on that? I mean, I'm sure it's not fun to hear critiques of a movie, but that was my little takeaways. I felt that they were a little bit out of place, not necessarily in the film itself, but just as an entry point. I think nowadays it would be great for there to be more sci-fi movies that young teens could watch, and it would just bring them into this wonderful sci-fi world of films, both new and old.
Thank you for those criticisms, and I actually agree with what you're saying 100%. And that was when I watched it through again after a few years of not watching it. They were the exact same thoughts I had. It's like, well, there's we'll call it an assault scene at the beginning. Uh, it's important to the story, but we don't need to see it full on like that, maybe. And in addition to that, there's a lot of swear words in there, cuss words. In 2012, there wasn't a lot of really hard sci-fi, graphic violence stuff. It was much more, like you said, Star Trekky, Star Warsy type thing. I mean, to this level, I wanted it to be a dark Star Trek, and to do dark Star Trek, you've got to go to the dark side. So it certainly goes into that territory. But now that the interesting thing was it's a two-film series, just like Rebel Moon. And Rebel Moon is kind of in the same tone and texture. Now, I watched Rebel Moon. I actually enjoyed it, and I thought it was actually interesting because I'm a fan of the same sort of, space stuff as Zack Snyder did. And I'm not at all ever saying that, he copied off me or whatever. It's just we were both inspired by the same source material, and we both made a very similar film. Of course, he had a much bigger budget. God bless him. I think the lesson from his film and my film is, and even Star Trek Generations, where Data swears when he crashes the Enterprise. Do we need cuss words in sci-fi? It does give a gritty edge to it at some point. The one time I really enjoyed a cuss word in sci-fi was Alien 3, when they're in the prison. This alien thing came through the ceiling and pulled a guy out up through the ceiling and disappeared. And one of the prisoners uses the F bomb, and it was really funny. And it worked in that situation. It's a great moment in Alien 3, and it was classic. But in general, I don't know if we need that. Maybe my sensibilities have changed a little bit, but, do we need nudity and, to feel a bit uncomfortable and all that, and show the brutality of humanity and to what level? We can infer this, I think. And I think that's the proper artistic choice for me in the future would be, we don't need to hear those words. We don't need to see graphic violence or nudity or whatever it might be, or graphic situations. And certainly I've been the most guilty of performing movie sins like that in my entire career. I've done some pretty graphic stuff.
It's there's a question that pops up, or rather, it's a statement that pops up every few years, and it is usually people complaining about swearing. And I've heard it said that, do we need swearing in films? I think, like you said in Alien 3, when I think it was Charles Dutton that said the F bomb in that, I think it worked in that. But if you were to take out swearing in Goodfellas or The Sopranos, that show or that film wouldn't work. Because in the world of The Sopranos and Goodfellas, people swore. Same with Deadwood. If you go back and watch another HBO show, that swearing worked in that one. I think because they are real worlds. I think in the world of Star One and Starship Rising and a lot of your sci-fi films, they are real worlds in the film that we're watching, but they're not real worlds that we, the viewer, know exist. So I think you could probably get away without swearing in those worlds, but you do need it for Sopranos and Goodfellas. Those films and shows would be really weird without language.
Yeah, and I think it's personally for in science fiction, the F bomb or the SH bomb. I think it's maybe it cheapens it a little bit. It narrows your audience a bit. What comes to mind is Dune, one and two films. I've really, really thought some of the best science fiction films ever made. And by the way, I adore the David Lynch version a lot. I really like that film too. Um, I feel that they pulled it off. They showed the brutality and the craziness by using other languages, and you can feel the curse words in it. In the Harkonnen language, you can feel it, and you can infer the brutality of their race. And I think that's the magic of modern filmmaking. We actually have a lot more freedom now, I think.
And then one of the best examples to use for tweaking the language would be Battlestar Galactica. Frack.
Yes.
They're not swearing, but you kind of know they are. So I think you could play around with that. But that's only they are tiny nitpicks. I wrote a typed review about Star One, and I did emphasize that even though there was that assault scene in there, I wasn't offended by the assault scene. And even though there were F bombs in the film, I wasn't offended by the language. I just felt that were it not for those, this would be a brilliant sci-fi movie or sci-fi movies once we get to Star One, the second movie, for younger people to sit down and be encompassed into it. Because I think with sci-fi, everything nowadays does feel like it's a franchise science fiction movie. On TV, it's Star Trek. On big screen, it's Star Wars. And on small screen, it's Star Wars. Everything's a big IP thing. And it would be really nice for some new IPs to rise up that aren't Star Trek or Star Wars. So we need some new ones to bring in the young fans. Because I was 7 years old when I first saw Star Wars. I was 8 years old when I first saw a Star Trek. It was Star Trek the Motion Picture, first ever Star Trek. Didn't even know there was a TV show called Star Trek when I first saw the motion picture. I don't think I would have seen Star One with the assault scene and the swearing at the time when I was that age, and I would have missed out on a really, gem of a movie.
And I really do think your criticism's 100% accurate and valid. And I can honestly say now, as maybe a more mature filmmaker, that if I made that movie today, I wouldn't have any of that, them there cuss words, and the graphic violence might be changed a little bit. As a young man, I was obsessed with gore, like really obsessed. Fangoria magazine was really the thing for me, and I'm just you can see it in my first film is extreme gore. And I don't know why. It's just something about who I was as a young man, and not in a bad way. It's just how I was. I was terrified of death and blood. Saw a lot of real violence, and then see it in a movie is like, oh, that's how I feel. But I've since become more understanding of when I see somebody in blood now, I'm very like, oh, I hope he's okay. So it's things change. I even got 4 pages in Fangoria magazine on my second film. That's a big deal. But now it's like, I wish it was Starlog, and eventually when I get the funding, I will be doing a new version of it, a complete recut with the new scenes, and it will change the film dramatically. Yeah, I'll probably cut out most of the F bombs for sure, and it's going to be much more high level sci-fi. And I've got a lot to do with it now because the technology's changed. I can really do some good stuff. Thankfully, it's all shot native 4K on the red cinema camera. So it's going to look really good once I get round to that. But that's, in the meantime, we've got Star One and Star One Resurrection. And the changes are Star One has a new introduction which sets up the universe. And I think that helps with your understanding of the story. The other thing that's most important is putting the voice of Stephen Manley in as the overseer is important because he's an actor and you want to listen to his voice. And because of that, it tells the story so much better. I think that's why you understand the movie more because of Stephen Manley. I hate to say that. It's all because of the actors. It's not me. Um, and the same with Star One Resurrection. You'll see a whole new sequence at the end with Stephen Manley as the overseer. It'll tie it all in together. And it's very exciting at the end, where it goes. Not to take anything away from the other actors, but I've expanded the universe a little bit, and it's always meant to be that way. But time killed me, and there's still that missing 1 hour of scenes, which let me tell you, is a beautiful opening to Starship Apocalypse that nobody's ever seen. Where there's a Disney actor who was in a Disney movie singing opera at the beginning. How he's performed this live a cappella piece in a spaceship, and I mean, I can't wait for the world to see that. And that leads into who the overseer is anyway. So there's all of this stuff coming, and it's very exciting for me. But at the moment, Star One and Star One Resurrection will live as this is where it's headed.
You'd mentioned expanding scenes and stuff for this. Were there any expanded scenes for Raja, who I think was amazing as I choose the main villain of the movie? But tell me about her scenes and were there extra things in Star One, the version, compared to Starship Rising?
Well, specifically Raja Barudi, she's got a very interesting, complicated past, an incredible actress. And on watching the film through again after a few years, I was like, your comment to me was, how interesting was she in this movie? And I had the same reaction. I don't know if it's the passage of time or something, but somehow her acting, her character, who she is in the film resonates and stands out as somebody really special. And not to take away from the other actors at all, but Raja has a certain magic. And I think she's becoming, at least to me, I think she's one of the great untapped acting talents in Hollywood. And certainly she's done a lot of, great character work and voice work in other films. But for me, she's the secret weapon in the film, which I've only just figured this out now after many years. She's really something special. And a lot of people seem to have the same feedback about her in the movie. She almost steals the movie in some places. And I know there's other scenes with her that can be included for sure. Little spoiler for the film Star One Resurrection. There's a lot of resurrection in that movie. I always said to her, this is where you die in this scene. I always wanted a little escape pod to fly off, and I think if you look closely, there's when her spaceship blows up. Spoiler alert! You might get a hint of a little escape pod leaving, and I always wanted her character to survive. So there's a possibility, if I could ever find her, I don't know where she is at the moment. If I could track her down, a movie based around her character would be pretty cool in the aftermath of all of this, because she's such an interesting character. She's got such a big backstory and she's such a strong actor and such a legitimate actor and human being, I would say. That would be a great thing to explore because it's kind of a weird tangent, but it would be a fascinating film. The other person I always like to shout out in this movie is Claudia Wells, who did such an incredible job as a starship captain. I adored her acting performance, and I kind of regret not having her in most of the film because she was so interesting. Brooke Lewis is another one. Did such an interesting job, and I remember Brooke Lewis has a fire in her soul that always comes out in her acting, and she's wonderful. Of course, Darren Jacobs did a great job, especially in the second film. He was very interesting. He took the character somewhere interesting. I mean, I could be honest, all the cast in the film, Emily Rose Morrison, I wish I could do more with her. She's such an interesting character, and I bet the journey of life would make her an even better actor now. and different actor from where she was, because she was in a certain place with her music career. And now the whole world has changed. I bet she can deliver some incredible acting performances. So, I would love to see her in another movie. I hope somebody can stick her in a film somewhere, because she's fascinating as a human being. And, we all carry the burden of life. And I would say pretty much every actor in the film, Ralph Guzzo is incredible. It was a tough film to do. It was a film done in the time when there was no new Star Wars. Uh, and we just had Star Trek that was very polished and colorful, and this was a dark Star Trek. It was intended to be a dark science fiction-y type thing. And boy, if I had my time over again, it would be even darker and way more epic. And so I'm hoping one day I can polish it up to be, a real classic sci-fi without the cuss words, without as many assault scenes in it. The one thing that gets me is nobody has ever said to me, "Oh, well done. You've shown this planet that's kind of a hybrid. It's not a Muslim planet. It's not a Catholic planet. It's not a Christian planet, but it's a religious planet. I didn't want it to be assigned to a religion. But you've got this religiously crazy planet where women are oppressed. The women rise up and take over the planet and kill off the men with the aid of robots." Now, nobody's ever said, "Oh, wow, great, well done." You'd think of this political climate, somebody would come shake my hand for that. No, no, people tend to avoid that and just talk about the movie as a science fiction entity. But I don't know if I was making a statement, but I found that an interesting concept, and I like the concept of people rising up in rebellion. I'm not affiliated with any political or religious groups whatsoever, and my politics are not in this movie. So you're not getting a sense of me as a person telling the world what I think. I set up a world and let the world live by itself, And the only other thing I would say is, it originally was, I wanted to do a Blake Seven type movie, but it got too dark for, a Blake Seven type movie in the end. And that's the real tragedy. However, the one thing I'll say, the voice of the robot dude, his name is Paul Darrow, and you may know him from Blake Seven. And yes, I recorded that audio back in 2001 when he was alive. I got him to do a whole bunch of voiceover stuff for me, and his voice is in Battle Space and also a couple of other things, and that's just what he did for me. I paid him quite a bit of money, sit in a hotel room, record a bunch of voiceovers for upcoming movies. So I had to kind of recraft his voice a little bit to be in this. And I adore Paul Darrow as an actor, and he's a wonderful human being. And I was devastated when he passed away. So I like the fact that there's a lot of Blake Seven in this movie, even the name Star One. Yes, there was an episode of Blake Seven also called Star One, and that's not by accident, I will say that.